Hello, this is Adrian Laurie, and this is the first in a series of videos that I'm doing called The History and Philosophy of Psychotherapy, a Map of the Territory. In this series, I'm going to give you an overview of the psychotherapy field so that you've got an idea of what's in it. I'm trying to be both comprehensive on the one hand and simple on the other. Um, in this first part of the series, I'm going to talk about what I think of as the 7 classic therapy traditions. Okay, those being the psychoanalytic, the cognitive behavioral, the existential, the systemic, the somatic, the transpersonal, and the expressive. In the second part of the series, I'm going to talk about what I think of as the sub-traditions of these 7 basic traditions. And I'm going to show you that there's 2 sub-traditions in each of these traditions. So you can actually think of these as 7 pairs of traditions. So we'll be going more into detail, the specifics of these different traditions. Sub-traditions being like in the cognitive behavioral tradition, we got the cognitive sub-tradition and the behavioral sub-tradition. In the psychoanalytic tradition, we got the classic psychoanalytic sub-tradition and the object relations tradition, and et cetera, et cetera. Each of the broad traditions can be divided into 2 sub-traditions, one of which is more internally focused and the other is more externally focused. In the third part of the series, we'll look at what I think of as the meta-elements of therapy. This has a lot to do with the common factors, which is a research tradition in the therapy field that looks at what makes therapists effective regardless of their tradition. So people in the common factors research tradition compare therapists who are more effective to therapists who are less effective, and they say, well, what are they doing different? So things like the importance of the therapeutic relationship, or more recently, the importance of soliciting client feedback, candid client feedback, so you can make adjustments. And then in the final part of the series, we'll look at what I think of as the sister traditions to therapy, which are healing and coaching. Healing including things like EMDR, eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, tapping on points of the meridian energy system, etc. And coaching, which I think is often an informal part of therapy, instructing clients pretty specifically to help them accomplish concrete life tasks. And so we'll look at that too in that last video. But this video, first part of the series, we're just going to look at the 7 broad traditions, and I'll say a little bit about the foremost innovator for each of these traditions. Okay, starting with the psychoanalytic tradition, for whom the foremost innovator, as we know, was Freud. Okay, Sigmund Freud had a mentor named Joseph Breuer, who was a neurologist. Freud was also a neurologist. And Breuer had found that by allowing a patient with so-called hysterical symptoms, which was physical symptoms for which the doctor could find no physical cause. This could be paralysis or blindness. Back in those times, there were these fairly extreme physical symptoms that Breuer found he could cure by having the patient talk pretty freely about things. And Freud got interested in this as well and found that what often seemed to be lying beneath the surface was sexual material, and that as the patient would talk about these things, the symptoms would go away. So that was kind of the birth of psychoanalysis, the essence of which was back then, the patient was lying on a couch, which stimulated a kind of younger kind of consciousness, right? A more tender type of consciousness, was conducive to a more free flow of material for the technique that the therapist would teach to the patient. We call them clients now. Some people still call them patients. Which was free association, right? And so the therapist would teach the patient to free associate and just say whatever came to mind with no censorship if possible, or at least as little censorship as possible. Whatever might be in there, crazy stuff, irrational stuff, just let me know what's going on in there, whatever it may be. That was free association. And then the therapist would offer interpretations, which really is just a way to kind of make sense of this material. And so when it's done right, it's appropriately timed, and it actually, for the patient, is clarifying and organizing of their experience. The book I might recommend the most when it comes to psychoanalysis is a book by an analyst. His name was Bruno Bettelheim, and it came out, I believe, in the early 80s, called Freud and Man's Soul. The reason I recommend this book is that, first of all, it's pretty short and very readable, but it makes the point that when Freud's work was translated into English by a guy named Strachey, I think his first name was James Strachey, Bettelheim proposes that the translation basically was like kind of bad, and it made Freud seem far more kind of intellectualistic and antiseptic and clinical than Freud actually was, and that in the original German there was a strong literary quality to Freud's work and to his writing. Apparently Freud was actually quite well respected by other German writers for his literary abilities as a writer. And Bettelheim was saying that the real true psychoanalysis that Freud was doing and the people around him were doing really had a lot of soul. And I would say that, I've gotten to know some psychoanalytically oriented people, and I think that when they're really, of decent quality, that there's a lot of soul there, and that the work itself, when it's done well, really is first of all, it's an experiential kind of work. It's not heady. It's not intellectualistic. Maybe people aren't lying on a couch anymore, but that was part of it originally. It's important to remember. But that plus the free association, it's a very experiential process. And then again, if these interpretations are timed right, they can be very organizing. Imagine someone who's kind of not clear that they're sad. The therapist says, perhaps you're sad. That can be very, very helpful. Not all of us got that help identifying what was going on for us when we were little. So sometimes that can be quite useful. So psychoanalysis, in its essence, not so intellectualistic as we tend to think of it. Okay. All right. Let's move on. The next tradition that we're going to look at is the cognitive behavioral tradition. Okay. And the person I would put as the foremost innovator, or at least forerunner to this tradition, would be Alfred Adler. Okay. And now Adler is not often associated with the cognitive behavioral tradition, but the two people who are, that would be Albert Ellis and Aaron Beck, cite as their foremost influence Alfred Adler. So I think it makes a lot of sense to consider Adler the forerunner to the cognitive behavioral tradition. And Adler was kind of an associate of Freud's. He got interested in Freud's work pretty early on. Eventually there was a parting of the ways with Freud because Adler wasn't towing the line. But Adler was interested in how do we use our mind to be adaptive in life and make life work. Now, an interesting thing about Adler is he had a very holistic perspective, and in fact, one Adlerian proposed that a better name for Adler's therapy than what Adler ended up calling it, which was individual psychotherapy, which doesn't mean individualistic. It was individual more in the sense of total. That's a weird translation, I think. But this Adlerian proposed that a better name for Adler's psychotherapy would have been holistic psychotherapy. Interestingly enough, but the word didn't exist at that time. The person who then invented the word was Adler was in contact with this person, was interested in his work. But Adler was a holistic thinker and was interested in how do we use our minds in the context of real biological life. Biological not meaning physical, but meaning the logic of life, right? So Adler was looking at the mind in the context of real human life and saying, hey, there's problems here on this earth for us to solve here and now as we are. And how do we solve those problems? How do clients in psychotherapy or patients in psychotherapy solve these problems? And Adler proposed that we all had a basic need for a sense of efficacy, and deeper than that, we had a need for efficacy, for a real ability to deal with the challenges of life, and that these are real challenges, and that they can be dealt with in a way that works, that actually makes life work, or in a way that doesn't work. And Adler proposed that there's two basic ways that we can deal with the challenges of life. We can look at them and address them, deal with them head on, or we look away, but we still need that sense of efficacy. So if we look away, run away, or avoid the challenges, we'll try to get ourselves to believe in a way that's basically false and isn't really going to hold up too well, that we're still okay, we're still effective, right? So this would be a kind of like pseudo-efficacy, or a sort of false sense of efficacy that isn't very stable and isn't really a good structure psychologically to kind of keep us in tune and keep us going. So Adler's therapy, he thought of it as oriented around encouraging clients to look at their problems directly and deal with them directly. All right? That may seem a little abstract. The author that I actually recommend in this connection is not technically an Adlerian, but I think there's so much overlap between his work and Adler's work. And Adler you can only really read in translation because he also is writing in German. But the author I would recommend actually is Nathaniel Branden. Okay, and Branden wrote a book called The Six Pillars of Self-Esteem. I think this was in the 80s. Branden's career kind of spanned the 70s, the 80s, and the early 90s. But Branden early on was basically a cognitivist. He became a lot more eclectic, at least in his in how he worked with clients. Once he got a little bit more into his career, but he was always kind of holistically oriented. Similar to Adler, whereas Adler thought in terms of a sense of efficacy, or as Adler called it, striving for superiority. That's a term that you might learn in psychotherapy school if you go to psychotherapy school. But superiority in the sense of being superior to challenges, being effective to deal with challenges, not better than other people. Adler was real explicit about that. Again, translation issues. But Branden wrote about self-esteem, which is quite similar to efficacy. And Branden was a little embarrassed about how the so-called self-esteem movement went, just praising everyone. It's like, hey, you're special no matter what. Branden didn't like that. For Branden, self-esteem was something that, yes, there could be external facilitation of the development of self-esteem, but that self-esteem also needs to be earned, that it takes work to build it, to maintain it, because again, similar to Adler, although Branden I don't think was that influenced by Adler, but they're very similar. Life is kind of hard, and human beings sometimes we can think that like, well, maybe if I just don't look at it, I won't have to deal with it, which then causes all sorts of problems. So it takes a little kind of courage and guts to look at these problems and address them in action. It's kind of hard. And to the degree that you do that, and the more that you do that, you do develop a sense of like, okay, I can handle life's problems. Because when you do that, and the more consistently you do it, you do solve life problems. You're able to make things work, and you say, oh, well, okay, I could do this. So it's a realistic sense of efficacy, or a realistic self-esteem, as therapists sometimes call it. Okay, and Adler and Brandon, I think, are really good kind of representatives of you could say, a holistic cognitive behavioral tradition. Now, in the next video, we'll get into sub-traditions, and I might say a little bit about like dialectical behavior therapy, and who the behaviorists were and what they did. But for now, we'll leave it at that. And Six Pillars of Self-Esteem, I think, is a good book to read. That'll give you a good look at that tradition. Therapists I've recommended to generally like his material quite a bit, Nathaniel Brandon. Okay, so next we're going to go into the existential tradition of psychotherapy. Okay, and we've already dealt with a decent amount of material, so you might want to pause the video and come back to it later. But I'm just going to go on. The existential tradition. Foremost innovator here, Otto Rank, okay, who was another associate of Freud early on. And Otto Rank became interested in these different existential issues like the human will, right? The human capacity to choose, right? This ends up going along with other kinds of existential awarenesses, like the awareness of our eventual death, what is the meaning of life, right? These kinds of issues. The basics of an existential therapy, you could say, is to kind of address these real here and now issues of how do we relate to these kind of basic factors of existence, okay? One very famous practitioner of this approach, although it's a little subtle, is Carl Rogers. Carl Rogers, interestingly enough, was very influenced by Rank, who I believe came over to the United States and did some training, and where Rogers was going to school or something like that. So Rogers was quite influenced by Rank. And if you watch Rogers' approach, and here I'm going to recommend you find this video on YouTube of Rogers working with Gloria. These three famous therapy videos from I think the 1960s, like the earlier mid 1960s. You see Rogers working with this woman Gloria, and then you see Fritz Perls from Gestalt therapy working with Gloria, and Albert Ellis working with Gloria. They all work with this woman Gloria, and she's not acting, she's presenting to them some real issues that she wants help with, and the three have very different approaches. But if you look at Rogers, it's masterful and it's brilliant, and it's really kind of amazing to see the session. There's a real arc to it. And I want you to look out for the existential element in Rogers' approach. One friend told me that his mentor had this saying, Carl Rogers is not Mr. Rogers. But we sometimes think that he's because he had such a gentle, friendly approach. But there's also a bit of badassery in there. And, Rogers' approach was just to kind of reflect back his best understanding of what the client meant by what they were saying. It can seem quite gentle, and it's just all about, empathy. But there's a subtle aspect to it, which is this almost like an indirect communication that you are in charge of your life, that it's up to you to make your own decisions. And I, the therapist, am not going to save you by telling you what to do. And that can be an aspect of all sorts of different therapies, but there's a way in which it's kind of central in the existential approach, okay? A great kind of synthesizing author for the existential approach is Irvin Yalom, and he wrote an excellent book called Existential Psychotherapy. It's a bit of a tome, kind of a textbook, but I loved it. I find Wilhelm very readable, even in the textbooks. And the way he breaks it down is the four basic existential concerns being death, freedom, meaninglessness, and isolation. It sounds a little bleak, but the whole frame is that by dealing with these issues, we can really live life fully. And so it ends up being an inspiring kind of approach. Okay? All right, so that's the existential tradition. Next, we're going to look at the systemic tradition. Okay? Um, family systems, this kind of thing. Foremost innovator who I would name would be Milton Erickson. And to my mind, Erickson is kind of like the North American Freud in terms of the stature of the genius level. Erickson, in addition to being, a systemic guy, was such a genius of communication. Someone referred to him as the Mozart of communication, but such a genius of communication that level of his work, the style of communication, can apply to any psychotherapy tradition that you're doing, and really any communicative endeavor. An incredibly sophisticated approach to communication that had everything to do with multi-level communication. In a way, communicating like an artist, where all the different levels are important and meaningful. Not just the words you're saying, but the tone, the rhythm, the underlying metaphorical implications and other implications, etc. And learning to communicate in a way that really works and is effective. Milton Erickson is genius. And you can look up on YouTube. The Milton Erickson Foundation has a YouTube channel, and they've posted some videos of Erickson. And there's a lot of videos of Jeff Zeig, who ended up being Erickson's kind of foremost protege, and he's got an amazing style of communication as well. I attended a workshop once with Zeig, and he was talking to the whole room, and I became hypnotized. Seriously, like I got into a fairly altered state, which just doesn't happen to me too much. Brilliant student of Erickson's, Jeff Zeig. Anyway, the systemic tradition is all about stimulating into play. I think that might be a Zeig term. A patient's resourcefulness, patient's inner resources, inner strengths. So it's in a way, a very American kind of therapy. Erickson was not interested in analyzing anything, right? He was only interested in stimulating into play a patient's resourcefulness when he was working with an individual, and when he was working with, say, a family or a couple, he would have people do unusual things that would end up changing the systemic dynamics in the family. All right. Very sophisticated, and I don't know that I've ever gotten all that good at it. I've not done very much family work, although I did a little, and I did have a supervisor who was kind of systemically oriented. But fascinating way of working, and very different from the rest of therapy, tending as it does to be a little bit, I don't know, heady in certain ways. So that's the systemic tradition. Okay. Now we're going through kind of quick, but in the next part we're gonna get more into detail. Next part, the next tradition, the somatic tradition. Foremost innovator here, Wilhelm Reich. Wilhelm Reich, another genius. All these folks were geniuses, but Reich was a genius, and he was a student of Freud's work. Freud talked a lot about repression, and Reich became interested in this question of, well, how does repression happen in the body? We are biological beings. We have bodies. Repression isn't something that happens exterior to the body, right, in some other disconnected realm. how is repression happening in the body? And Reich would work with people's bodies and pushing into muscle areas, having patients breathe in certain ways. And, as a lot of us are now familiar with, these kinds of things, even people going for massages, sometimes will have emotions come out, right? I've heard of people going to a yoga class and they start crying because one of the moves sort of like opens up a block somewhere and the motion starts to flow. Reich was all about this kind of thing. And so he was basically the father of the body psychotherapy tradition. This is a tradition oriented around working with sensation, movement, muscle tension, the breathing, working with these things in such a way to help clients work through emotions that are stuck, with the idea that these emotions get stuck in the body, right? We're upset about something, we're crying, and let's say we're children and we're not getting any support. It doesn't seem like there's any way to deal with it. Maybe we're even being yelled at. We got to close down the emotion, repress the emotion. That happens in the body because the body wants to sob or whatever. We got to close that down. And how do we do that? Well, we tighten up our body. We constrict the breathing. And so in the body psychotherapy tradition, we're working with these dynamics. I'm thinking of something to recommend here, and I suppose my favorite book, or the book that's influenced me most in this domain, was Alexander Lowen, who was a student of Reich. He wrote a book called Language of the Body. It's one of his earlier books, and it's kind of a little bit technical, but Lowen is real down to earth. I mean, body therapists are down to earth. I mean, that's kind of what they're all about. But Lowen's written some other books. One that I read early on, years ago, it's called Joy, the Surrender to the Body and to Life. I think that's a nice one, and it's pretty short. But that can give you an insight into body psychotherapy tradition. Okay. All right, on to the next tradition. Let's look at the transpersonal therapy tradition, the originator of which would be Carl Jung, who, again, associate of Freud, pretty close associate. I think they considered each other friends, and then eventually, broke up because Jung wasn't towing the line, But the transpersonal tradition is kind of a spiritually oriented tradition, and it's interested in integration of all the different aspects of the personality. And of course, when you're looking at different aspects of the personality, where are you? Well, you've got to be transcending those different aspects in order to look at them. Transpersonal tradition yielded the idea of working with subpersonalities, the child self, for example, or the warrior self, for example. There were techniques or modes of therapy that came out of this called voice dialogues, or I've heard therapists refer to it in the modern day as parts work. That all comes originally from Jung and a little later Roberto Assagioli developed a psychotherapy mode called psychosynthesis, which is part of the transpersonal tradition. So there's the idea of the shadow, that we push these parts of our personality that are not acceptable to us into the shadow. We can push our vulnerability into the shadow. We can push our aggression into the shadow. And that if we want integration and a full personality to live life fully, we got to get these things out of the shadow and integrate them, which can be difficult because we put them into the shadow because they seem super scary to us, Our inner monster, for example, scary, but we gotta integrate it if we're gonna live fully. You need some aggression in life, right? And the Jungians and the transpersonalists kind of deal with this. Um, so transpersonal tradition, and I don't know if I have a great book to recommend in this tradition. I'm sure there are plenty out there, but nothing's coming to my mind right now. Um, so Jung can be a little difficult to read. Um, well, anyway, maybe you'll find something that you like in that tradition, and maybe I'll have something in the next video about it. Okay, that's the transpersonal tradition. Okay, and finally we look at the expressive tradition. Now, the expressive tradition, expressive is kind of short for expressive arts. This is includes psychodrama. It includes using art in therapy. It includes dance movement therapy, music therapy, any therapy using the arts. Sand tray is kind of part of this. Um, Figurines in a tray of sand. You can do various interesting things with. And this isn't quite as unified a tradition as the other, so there's a few innovators we could name. Florence would be, to my mind, most important in the art therapy tradition. She came up with this great exercise called scribble drawing, where you draw a scribble and then you look to see what kind of images pop out at you in the scribble. You reinforce those images with your pencil, maybe tell a story about it that you can then sort of interpret, and can be very revealing about what's going on at a subtle level and helpful. Dance movement therapy, Marian Chase, that's an amazing method that involves almost a kind of physical empathy offered by the therapist with movement. You move in dance movement therapy, and it can be really powerful, transformative. Psychodrama, Jacob Moreno was the innovator there. And because Moreno is considered the inventor of group therapy and apparently important and influential in the field of sociology, if I have to name one innovator in the expressive tradition, it's going to be Moreno, just because his work seems so broadly significant beyond just the technique of psychodrama. But one of the goals in psychodrama is to enhance patients' or clients' role flexibility, right? The ability to be in different roles. And so in psychodrama, it's usually a kind of group work where someone who's kind of the central focus of a piece of work is sort of the protagonist, and the therapist acts as a director and helps the client who's going to be in this protagonist role choose other people from the group to then play people from this client's past or some situation that they're wanting to work with psychodramatically. And then the therapist kind of directs like a kind of scene that allows the client to have certain experiences and work through certain things in the context of this little drama that's set up. That may seem a little, it may be a little hard to grasp what actually occurs there, but I've experienced it a bit, and it can be pretty cool and powerful and cathartic and transformative and very emotional. Really interesting form of work. And so that's the expressive traditions. There's a book written by Moreno's son called, I believe it, gosh, what was it called? Mr. Spontaneity, maybe? Forgetting the title. Should really prepare these things before I make these videos. But if you look up book by Jacob Moreno's son, you it'll pop up. It's a little biography of Moreno, which I actually haven't read, but I've heard it's good, and I suspect that's a good way to learn about Moreno's work, at least if you're interested to learn about that. Okay, so that's the expressive tradition. All right, and that's the 7 traditions that so we looked at: the psychoanalytic and Freud, the cognitive behavioral and Alfred Adler. We looked at the existential and Otto Rank. We looked at the systemic and Milton Erickson. We looked at the somatic and Wilhelm Reich. We looked at the transpersonal and Carl Jung. And we looked at the expressive and Jacob Moreno, Florence Kane, Marian Chase. And so I think of these as the 7 basic therapy traditions. In the next part, we're going to go into more detail. We're going to break each of these broad traditions into 2 sub-traditions. What I've offered in this video is a little oversimplified, so we're going to go a little more into detail in the next part of this series. And then, again, we'll look at the meta elements, common factors, and then healing and coaching. And so, I hope you've enjoyed this video, and I hope it's given you a better sense of the classic therapy field. And we're going to go into more down the road. And I'm wishing you well. Thanks for your attention, and take care. It's been Adrian Laurie. Bye-bye.